Millionaire scolds young artist at son's grave, then breaks down when he discovers the shocking truth. Alexander Rothschild, at 58, stood atop the business world as the CEO of Rothschild Enterprises, a multinational conglomerate. His silver hair and tailored suits exuded power and wealth, but his steel blue eyes carried a perpetual sadness that even his billions couldn't erase. For all his success, Alexander had failed at the one thing that mattered most to him: being a father. His son, James, had died 5 years ago at the age of 25 in a car accident. The loss had shattered Alexander's world, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. He threw himself into his work, building his empire higher and higher, as if each new acquisition or merger could fill the void left by his son's death. But nothing could bring James back or erase the regret Alexander felt for the years of neglect and missed opportunities. On the other side of town, in a rundown apartment complex, lived Michael Foster, a 24-year-old struggling artist. With shaggy brown hair, paint-stained jeans, and a perpetual look of determination in his hazel eyes, Michael was the epitome of the starving artist. He worked part-time as a barista to make ends meet, but his true passion lay in his art. Vibrant, emotionally charged paintings that spoke of loss, hope, and the human condition. Michael's life had been marked by hardship. Orphaned at a young age, he had bounced between foster homes, never finding a place to truly call his own. Art had become his solace, his way of making sense of a world that often seemed cruel and indifferent. Despite the challenges, Michael maintained a quiet optimism, believing that his art could one day touch people's lives and make a difference. What neither Alexander nor Michael knew was that their lives were about to intersect in a way that would change them both forever. The catalyst for this meeting lay in a shared connection to James Rothschild, a connection that would soon come to light in the quiet solitude of a cemetery. As the story begins, Alexander is preparing for his weekly visit to his son's grave, a ritual he has maintained religiously since James's death. It's his way of staying connected to the son he feels he failed in life. Meanwhile, Michael is putting the finishing touches on his latest painting, a piece that holds a special significance he's not yet ready to reveal to the world. These two men, separated by wealth, age, and life experiences, are about to embark on a journey neither of them could have anticipated. Their encounter at James's grave will set in motion a series of events that will challenge their perceptions, heal old wounds, and possibly offer for a second chance at the father-son relationship both have longed for. On a crisp autumn morning, Alexander Rothschild's chauffeur-driven Bentley pulled up to the gates of Evergreen Cemetery. As he did every Saturday, Alexander stepped out of the car, a bouquet of white lilies in hand, James's favorite flowers. He nodded to his driver, signaling that he wanted to be alone, and made his way down the familiar path to his son's grave. As he approached the plot, Alexander's steps faltered. There, kneeling before James's headstone, was a young man he had never seen before. The stranger's head was bowed, his shoulders shaking slightly as if he were crying. For a moment, Alexander stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. This was his private time with his son, and the presence of this intruder stirred a mix of anger and curiosity within him. Clearing his throat loudly, Alexander stepped forward. The young man's head snapped up, revealing tear-stained cheeks and startled hazel eyes. Alexander was struck by how young he looked, about the same age James would be if he were still alive. "I'm sorry," the young man stammered, quickly wiping his eyes and standing up. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll go." "Wait," Alexander said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Who are you? Did you know my son?" The young man hesitated, his eyes darting between Alexander and the headstone. "My name is Michael," he said finally. "And yes, I knew James. We were friends." Alexander frowned. In the years since James's death, he had never encountered any of his son's friends at the grave. "Friends? I don't recall James ever mentioning you." A flicker of pain crossed Michael's face. "We met about a year before he died, at an art class." This revelation stunned Alexander. "Art class?" James never took art classes. Michael's expression softened. "He did. He was quite talented, actually. He said it was his escape, something just for him." Alexander felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. How could there be this whole part of his son's life that he knew nothing about? He had always assumed he knew everything about James, his interests, his friends, his aspirations. But this young man's words were opening up a chasm of uncertainty. "Why are you here?" Alexander demanded, his tone sharp with confusion and a touch of suspicion. Michael hesitated again, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a sketchbook. "James gave this to me before he died. He asked me to bring it here on the anniversary of his death. I've been doing it every year since." Alexander's hands trembled as he took the sketchbook. As he flipped through the pages, he saw his son's life unfold in a way he had never seen before. There were sketches of cityscapes, portraits of strangers, and abstract pieces that seemed to pulse with emotion. But what caught Alexander's breath were the self-portraits. Images of James that captured a vulnerability and depth that Alexander had never allowed himself to see. "I don't understand," Alexander murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't he ever tell me about this?" Michael's voice was gentle when he replied. "He wanted to. He talked about it often, but he was afraid you wouldn't approve. He said you had very specific ideas about what his life should be." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He remembered the arguments, the disappointed looks, the constant pressure he had put on James to follow in his footsteps. Had he really been so blind to his son's true passions? As Alexander stood there, lost in his thoughts, Michael quietly gathered his things. "I should go," he said softly. "I'm sorry if I upset you. That wasn't my intention." Alexander looked up, suddenly afraid to let Toulette's connection to his son slip away. "No, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay. Tell me about James. Tell me about the son I never knew." Michael hesitated, then nodded slowly. As they sat down on a nearby bench, Alexander clutching the sketchbook to his chest, neither man could have predicted how this chance encounter would change both their lives. The millionaire and the struggling artist, bound by their connection to a young man who had touched both their lives, were about to embark on a journey of discovery, healing, and unexpected kinship. As Michael began to speak, Alexander felt as if he was being introduced to his son for the first time. The James that Michael described was passionate, creative, and full of dreams, a far cry from the dutiful but distant young man Alexander thought he knew. "James loved to paint cityscapes at night," Michael said, a fond smile playing on his lips. "He said the city came alive in a different way after dark, showing its true colors." Alexander nodded, remembering how James would often come home late, claiming he had been working at the office. Had he actually been out painting the city streets? As Michael continued to share stories, Alexander's mind raced with new revelations. He learned that James had been planning to quit his job at Rothschild Enterprises to pursue art full-time. He discovered that his son had been saving up to open a small gallery, wanting to provide a platform for other struggling artists. "The night before the accident," Michael said softly, "James told me he was finally going to tell you everything. He was nervous but excited. He said he hoped you would understand." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. His son had been on the verge of sharing his true self, and Alexander had missed the opportunity to truly know him. As they talked, Alexander began to see parallels between Michael and James. They shared the same passion for art, the same drive to make a difference in the world. It was as if, through Michael, he was getting a glimpse of the man James might have become. Suddenly, Alexander remembered something. "Wait here," he said to Michael before hurrying back to his car. When he returned, he was carrying a small, ornate box. "After James died, I couldn't bring myself to go through his things," Alexander explained, his voice thick with emotion. "But I kept this box. It was always on his desk, but I never knew what was inside." With trembling hands, Alexander opened the box. Inside were several folded pieces of paper and a small key. As he unfolded the papers, his breath caught in his throat. They were letters. Letters James had written to him but never sent. In these letters, James poured out his heart. He wrote about his love for art, his dreams for the future, and his deep desire for his father's understanding and approval. The final letter, dated just days before the accident, expressed James's determination to finally tell his father the truth. As Alexander read the letters aloud, his voice breaking with each word, Michael listened in respectful silence. The weight of missed opportunities and unspoken words hung heavy in the air. When he finished reading, Alexander looked up at Michael, his eyes brimming with tears. "I never knew," he whispered. "All this time, and I never knew." Michael placed a comforting hand on Alexander's shoulder. "James loved you," he said softly. "He always spoke of you with respect and admiration. He just wanted you to see him for who he truly was." As the two men sat there, surrounded by the quiet of the cemetery, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The son he thought he knew was gone, replaced by a more complex, more vibrant individual. And sitting beside him was a young man who seemed to embody everything James had been and could have become. In that moment, Alexander made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He didn't know exactly what form it would take, but he knew that somehow he had to honor his son's memory and make amends for the understanding he had failed to give in life. As Alexander sat there, James's letters still clutched in his hands, a resolve began to form within him. He turned to Michael, his eyes alight with a newfound purpose. "Michael," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him, "I want to do something to honor James's memory and the dreams he never got to fulfill." Michael looked at him curiously. "What do you have in mind?" Alexander took a deep breath. "I want to open the gallery James dreamed of. Not just any gallery, but one that supports young, struggling artists like yourself. A place that nurtures creativity and gives a platform to new voices in the art world." Michael's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Rothschild, that's an incredible idea. But are you sure? It's a big undertaking, and the art world is very different from the corporate world you're used to." Alexander nodded firmly. "I'm sure. I may not know much about art, but I know business. And more importantly, I know this is what James would have wanted. But I can't do it alone." He paused, looking intently at Michael. "I want you to help me, to be a partner in this venture." The young artist sat back, stunned. "Me? But why? You barely know me." "Because you knew the real James," Alexander replied softly. "You shared his passion, his vision, and I think he would have wanted this." Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing the offer. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said, a mix of excitement and trepidation in his voice. "Let's do it. For James." Over the next few weeks, Alexander threw himself into the project with the same intensity he applied to his corporate dealings. He secured a prime location in the heart of the arts district, hired contractors to renovate the space, and began the process of establishing the James Rothschild Memorial Gallery. However, as news of the project spread, Alexander began to face unexpected consequences. His board of directors at Rothschild Enterprises expressed concern about his sudden shift in focus. Some shareholders worried that this foray into the art world would distract from the company's core business. Alexander found himself having to justify his actions to people who had never questioned him before. "This isn't just a vanity project," he explained during a tense board meeting. "It's about corporate social responsibility, about giving back to the community. It's good for our image, and more importantly, it's the right thing to do." Despite his arguments, Alexander could see the doubt in his colleagues' eyes. For the first time in years, he felt his control over the company he had built slipping. Meanwhile, his relationship with Michael was evolving in unexpected ways. As they worked together on the gallery, Alexander found himself opening up to the young artist, sharing stories about James, and even talking about his own regrets as a father. One evening, as they were reviewing portfolio submissions for the gallery's opening exhibition, Michael looked up at Alexander with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said hesitantly, "sometimes when we're working like this, you remind me of my own father." Alexander felt a warmth spread through his chest at these words. "Oh? Tell me about him." Michael's face clouded. I never knew him, or my mother. They died when I was very young. I grew up in foster care." The revelation hit Alexander hard. He had assumed Michael came from a background similar to James's, privileged, supported. Learning the truth made him see the young artist in a new light. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I had no idea." Michael shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "It's okay. Art became my family. It's what got me through the tough times." In that moment, Alexander felt a surge of protectiveness towards Michael. Here was a young man who had faced unimaginable hardships, yet still managed to pursue his passion with determination and grace. It reminded Alexander of the strength he had always admired in his own son. As the weeks passed and the gallery's opening day approached, Alexander found himself caught between two worlds. In one, he was the hard-nosed CEO, fighting to maintain his grip on the corporate empire he had built. In the other, he was a grieving father, finding healing and purpose in honoring his son's memory alongside a young man who was becoming increasingly important to him. The duality of his life was taking its toll. Alexander was sleeping less, the stress evident in the new lines on his face. But despite the challenges, he felt more alive than he had in years. For the first time since James's death, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. As he stood in the half-finished gallery space, surrounded by crates of artwork waiting to be hung, Alexander realized that his decision had set him on an irreversible path. There would be no going back to the man he was before. The consequences of his choice were still unfolding, but one thing was clear. His life, and Michael's, would never be the same. While Alexander and Michael were engrossed in bringing the James Rothschild Memorial Gallery to life, a secondary plot was unfolding within the halls of Rothschild Enterprises. Victor Chambers, the company's ambitious CFO, saw Alexander's distraction as an opportunity to make his move for power. Victor had always resented playing second fiddle to Alexander. At 45, with slicked-back dark hair and a perpetual smirk, he embodied the cutthroat nature of corporate America. He had been waiting for years for a chance to prove that he could lead the company better than Alexander, and now that chance had finally arrived. In board meetings, Victor began to subtly undermine Alexander's authority. He raised concerns about the company's direction, hinting that perhaps it was time for fresh leadership. "I'm worried about Alexander," he confided to key board members in private conversations. "This art gallery project seems to have him distracted. Is this really the best use of company resources?" As Alexander spent more time at the gallery and less at the office, Victor stepped in to fill the void. He took on additional responsibilities, making sure he was seen as the steady hand guiding the company while the CEO was preoccupied. Meanwhile, another thread of the secondary plot was developing around Sarah Chen, a young intern at Rothschild Enterprises. Sarah, a bright and ambitious 22-year-old business student, had always admired Alexander Rothschild from afar. She had joined the company hoping to learn from him, but found herself disappointed by his frequent absences. One day, frustrated by a problem she couldn't solve, Sarah decided to seek out Alexander for advice. Unable to find him at the office, she followed a hunch and made her way to the gallery construction site. There, she found Alexander not in his usual suit, but in jeans and a work shirt, helping Michael hang paintings. Sarah watched in amazement as the CEO she had put on a pedestal laughed and joked with the young artist, looking more human than she had ever seen him. Gathering her courage, Sarah approached them. "Mr. Rothschild, I'm Sarah Chen, an intern at Rothschild Enterprises. I was hoping to talk to you about a project." Alexander looked surprised but not displeased. "Sarah, of course. What can I help you with?" As Sarah explained her dilemma, she couldn't help but notice the way Alexander listened intently, his eyes alight with genuine interest. It was a stark contrast to the distracted, aloof CEO she had glimpsed at the office. After offering Sarah some advice, Alexander introduced her to Michael and explained the gallery project. Sarah found herself drawn into their enthusiasm, offering to help in any way she could. As she left the gallery that day, Sarah felt conflicted. On one hand, she was inspired by Alexander's passion for the project and his willingness to step out of his comfort zone. On the other hand, she couldn't help but worry about the rumors she had heard at the office about the company's uncertain future. These three threads, Victor's power play, Sarah's discovery, and the growing bond between Alexander and Michael, would continue to intertwine and complicate the main narrative. Victor's machinations threatened not just Alexander's position, but the very existence of the gallery project. Sarah's newfound understanding of Alexander put her in a unique position to potentially bridge the gap between the corporate world and Alexander's new passion. And through it all, the relationship between Alexander and Michael continued to evolve, becoming both a source of strength and a point of vulnerability for both men. As these secondary plots developed, they added layers of complexity to the story, challenging the characters in unexpected ways and setting the stage for the conflicts and resolutions to come. As the weeks passed and the gallery's opening day drew nearer, the relationship between Alexander and Michael continued to evolve in unexpected ways. What had begun as a chance encounter born of shared grief was blossoming into something neither man had anticipated. A bond that was part mentorship, part friendship, and increasingly reminiscent of a father-son relationship. For Alexander, spending time with Michael was like getting a second chance at fatherhood. He found himself looking forward to their daily meetings at the gallery, where conversations about art and business often gave way to more personal discussions. Alexander shared stories about his own father, a stern man who had pushed him relentlessly toward success. In turn, Michael opened up about his experiences in the foster care system, the loneliness he had felt, and how art had become his refuge. One evening, as they were working late at the gallery, Alexander noticed Michael struggling with a large canvas. Without thinking, he stepped in to help, and together they maneuvered the painting into place. As they stepped back to admire their work, Alexander felt a surge of paternal pride. He placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, a gesture that felt surprisingly natural. "You know, Michael," Alexander said softly, "working with you on this project, it's helped me more than I can say. I feel like I'm getting to know James in a way I never did when he was alive. And in a way, I feel like I'm getting a second chance to be the father I should have been." Michael was quiet for a moment, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Alexander," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "I never had a father. But if I did, I'd want him to be someone like you." The moment hung between them, fraught with unspoken emotions. Then, almost simultaneously, they moved forward and embraced. It was an awkward hug at first, both men unused to such displays of affection, but it quickly deepened into something genuine and heartfelt. From that night on, their relationship took on a new dimension. Alexander found himself taking a more active interest in Michael's life beyond the gallery project. He attended one of Michael's small art shows, beaming with pride as he watched the young artist discuss his work with potential buyers. When Michael mentioned offhand that he had never learned to drive, Alexander insisted on teaching him, leading to a series of both frustrating and hilarious lessons in Alexander's luxury cars. For Michael, who had grown up with a void where parental love should have been, Alexander's growing affection and support were both wonderful and terrifying. He found himself looking to the older man for advice and approval, while simultaneously fearing that this newfound relationship was too good to be true. Their evolving bond did not go unnoticed. Sarah, during her increasingly frequent visits to the gallery, observed the changing dynamic with a mix of warmth and concern. She could see how much good the relationship was doing for both men, but she also worried about the potential fallout if things went wrong. Victor, too, took note of Alexander's growing attachment to Michael. In his eyes, it was further evidence of Alexander's unfitness to lead the company. He began to spin a narrative among the board members, suggesting that Alexander was having some sort of midlife crisis, abandoning his responsibilities to play mentor to a young artist. Despite these external pressures, Alexander and Michael continued to grow closer. They developed inside jokes, shared confidences, and began to instinctively turn to each other in moments of doubt or celebration. Alexander found himself imagining a future where Michael was a permanent part of his life, perhaps even legally. The idea of adoption, once a distant and abstract concept, began to take root in his mind. For his part, Michael was blossoming under Alexander's mentorship and affection. His art took on new depths, inspired by the complex emotions stirred up by this unexpected relationship. He began to cautiously hope for a future where he wasn't alone, where he had a family to call his own. As the gallery neared completion, both men realized that something profound had changed in their lives. The project that had brought them together was almost finished, but the relationship they had built was just beginning. Neither could have predicted where their chance encounter at James's grave would lead, but both were grateful for the journey they had embarked upon together. Yet as their bond deepened, the outside world was closing in. The forces aligned against them were gathering strength, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the strength of their newfound relationship and forced both Alexander and Michael to confront their deepest fears and strongest desires. The night of the James Rothschild Memorial Gallery's grand opening arrived, bringing with it a potent mix of excitement, tension, and looming confrontation. The gallery space, once bare and echoing, now hummed with life. Paintings and sculptures, carefully curated by Michael and Alexander, adorned the walls and pedestals. The guest list was a who's who of the art world, mixed with curious members of high society and, of course, key figures from Rothschild Enterprises. Alexander stood at the entrance, greeting guests with a warmth that surprised many who knew him only as the stern CEO. Michael flitted about the space, nervously adjusting paintings and chatting with attendees about the artwork. Both men frequently sought each other out with their eyes, drawing strength from each other's presence. As the evening progressed, the gallery filled with the buzz of conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. Critics murmured appreciatively over the bold new talents on display, while potential buyers engaged in hushed negotiations. It seemed the gallery was off to a successful start. However, the atmosphere shifted palpably when Victor Chambers arrived, flanked by several board members. His eyes scanned the room calculatingly before settling on Alexander. With a smirk, he made his way over. "Quite a spectacle, Alexander," Victor said, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "I must say, I'm impressed. It's not every day a titan of industry decides to play at being a patron of the arts." Alexander tensed, sensing the threat underlying Victor's words. "This isn't playing, Victor. This gallery represents something important, not just to me, but to the community." Victor's smirk widened. "Oh, I'm sure it does. But I wonder, have you given any thought to how it looks to our shareholders, to see our CEO more concerned with hanging paintings than running the company?" Before Alexander could respond, Michael approached, having sensed the tension from across the room. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, placing a supportive hand on Alexander's shoulder. Victor's eyes narrowed at the gesture. "Ah, and this must be the young protégé I've heard so much about. Tell me, boy, do you have any idea of the damage you've done?" Michael bristled at Victor's tone, but Alexander stepped in. "That's enough, Victor. This isn't the time or place for this discussion." "On the contrary," Victor replied, raising his voice slightly, "I think this is exactly the right time and place. Let's lay all our cards on the table, shall we?" With that, Victor launched into a scathing critique of Alexander's recent leadership, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. He accused Alexander of neglecting his duties, of jeopardizing the company's future for a personal vanity project. As he spoke, more and more people turned to listen, the buzz of conversation dying down. Alexander, usually so composed, felt his control slipping. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the watching crowd, heard the whispers beginning to circulate. Everything he had worked for, both in his company and in this new venture, seemed to be crumbling around him. Just as Alexander was about to respond, potentially saying something he'd regret, Michael stepped forward. With a calm he didn't feel, he addressed not just Victor, but the entire room. "If I may," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I'd like to share something with all of you. Something about James Rothschild and about the man his father has become." As Michael began to speak, the room fell silent. Alexander, Victor, and all the assembled guests listened intently, unaware that they were witnessing a turning point that would change everything. Michael took a deep breath, acutely aware of all eyes upon him. He had never been comfortable in the spotlight, preferring to let his art speak for him. But in this moment, he knew he had to find his voice. "James Rothschild was my friend," Michael began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He was a talented artist, a kind soul, and a man who desperately wanted to bridge two worlds. The world of business he was born into and the world of art he loved." He gestured to the paintings around them. "This gallery isn't just a vanity project or a distraction. It's the fulfillment of James's dream, a dream he shared with me in the months before his death. He wanted to create a space where new artists could be seen and heard, where creativity could flourish without the pressure of commercial success." Michael turned to Alexander, his eyes filled with emotion. "When Mr. Rothschild approached me about this project, I was skeptical. I thought he was just a businessman trying to ease his conscience. But as we worked together, I saw a man transforming before my eyes. I saw a father grieving for his son. Yes, but also a leader rediscovering his purpose. He addressed the crowd again, his voice rising with passion. The Alexander Rothschild I've come to know isn't neglecting his company. He's expanding its vision. He's showing that a corporation can be more than just a profit machine. It can be a force for good, a catalyst for culture and creativity. Victor scoffed, but Michael pressed on. You speak of damage, sir, but what I've seen is growth. I've watched Mr. Mess Rothschild inspire his employees in ways that go beyond quarterly reports. I've seen him connect with people from all walks of life, understanding their struggles and aspirations in a way he never did before. Sarah Chen, who had been watching the confrontation unfold, stepped forward. If I may, she said, her voice shaking slightly, I can attest to what Michael is saying. As an intern at Rothschild Enterprises, I've seen firsthand the positive impact of Mr. Rothschild's new approach. Employee morale is up, and we're attracting a more diverse pool of talent than ever before. Alexander looked at Sarah in surprise, touched by her unexpected support. Victor, however, was not swayed. Pretty words, he sneered, but they don't change the fact that our stock price has taken a hit. Shareholders don't care about feel-good stories. They care about returns. It was at this point that Alexander finally found his voice. You're right, Victor, he said, his tone measured but firm. Shareholders do care about returns, but they also care about sustainability, about a company's image and its role in society. What we're doing here isn't just about art. It's about corporate social responsibility, about investing in our community. He addressed the watching crowd, his voice gaining strength. Rothschild Enterprises has always been a leader in our industry, but leadership isn't just about making money. It's about setting an example, about showing that business can be a positive force in the world. This gallery and the outreach programs we're developing alongside it are just the beginning. Alexander moved to stand beside Michael, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. Michael talked about bridging two worlds. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're bringing the innovation and drive of the business world together with the creativity and vision of the art world. And in doing so, we're creating something greater than the sum of its parts. The room was silent as Alexander's words sank in. Then, slowly, applause began to build. It started with Sarah and spread through the crowd, growing in volume until it filled the gallery. Victor, seeing the tide turning against him, tried one last gambit. This is all very touching, he said, raising his voice above the applause. But it doesn't change the fact that you've been neglecting your duties, Alexander. The board will have to consider whether you're still fit to lead the company. It was at this moment that an unexpected voice joined the conversation. An elderly man who had been quietly observing from the corner stepped forward. It was Howard Rothschild, Alexander's father and the company's former CEO. I think I can speak to that, Howard said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. I've watched my son transform this company over the years, taking it to heights I never dreamed possible. And now I see him expanding that vision even further. If that's not effective leadership, I don't know what is. He turned to Alexander, his eyes shining with pride. You've done something I never had the courage to do, son. You've found a way to honor your principles while still driving the business forward. The board would be fools to question your leadership. The gallery erupted in another round of applause. Victor, realizing he had lost this battle, retreated with as much dignity as he could muster. As the applause died down and the event returned to its celebratory atmosphere, Alexander found himself overwhelmed with emotion. He looked at Michael, at Sarah, at his father, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The conflict wasn't fully resolved, there would still be challenges ahead. But in this moment, he knew he was on the right path. The James Rothschild Memorial Gallery's opening night had become more than just a launch of a new art space. It had become a declaration of a new way of doing business, a bridge between commerce and culture. And for Alexander and Michael, it had become a public affirmation of the bond they had formed, a bond that had withstood its first major test and emerged stronger for it. In the days following the gallery opening, a palpable shift occurred both within Rothschild Enterprises and in Alexander's personal life. The confrontation at the gallery, rather than damaging the company's reputation as Victor had hoped, had instead sparked a wave of positive publicity. The story of a corporate giant embracing art and community investment had captured the public's imagination, leading to a surge of goodwill towards Rothschild Enterprises. Internally, the company was buzzing with new energy. Employees, inspired by Alexander's impassioned speech and the gallery's mission, began proposing their own ideas for community engagement and corporate responsibility. Sarah Chen, recognized for her initiative at the gallery opening, was promoted to lead a new task force focused on integrating social responsibility into all aspects of the company's operations. Victor, his power play having backfired spectacularly, found himself increasingly isolated within the company. Several board members, impressed by Alexander's vision and the positive response it had generated, privately assured Alexander of their continued support. But perhaps the most significant change was in Alexander's relationship with Michael. The young artist's eloquent defense of Alexander and the gallery project had deepened their bond, removing any lingering doubts either man might have had about their connection. One evening, as they sat in the gallery after hours, Alexander broached a subject he had been considering for some time. "Michael," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I want you to know that you've become like a son to me. I know I can never replace the family you lost, and I would never try to replace James. But I was wondering, how would you feel about making our relationship official? I'd like to adopt you, if you're open to the idea." Michael sat in stunned silence for a moment, his eyes wide with surprise and emotion. "Alexander, I don't know what to say. Are you sure?" Alexander nodded, his eyes glistening. "I've never been more sure of anything. You've brought so much into my life, Michael. You've helped me heal, helped me become a better person. I'd be honored to call you my son." Tears welling up in his eyes, Michael nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I'd like that very much." This moment marked a turning point not just for Alexander and Michael, but for Rothschild Enterprises as well. With his personal life finding new purpose and stability, Alexander turned his attention to transforming his company. He announced a new direction for Rothschild Enterprises, one that placed equal emphasis on profit and social responsibility. The James Rothschild Memorial Gallery became the flagship of a new charitable arm of the company, dedicated to supporting the arts and providing opportunities for underprivileged youth. Michael, with his artistic background and newfound business acumen, was named as its director. This new direction wasn't without its challenges. Some old guard executives, Victor among them, resisted the changes. But Alexander, with the support of his board and the public, stood firm. He knew that this path, though difficult, was the right one, for his company, for his legacy, and for the memory of his son James. As news of Alexander's adoption of Michael spread, it added a personal touch to the company's transformation, further endearing Rothschild Enterprises to the public. The story of the millionaire and the artist he met at his son's grave became a symbol of redemption, second chances, and the power of opening one's heart. A year after the gallery opening, Alexander stood in his office at Rothschild Enterprises, looking out over the city. The view was the same as it had always been, but Alexander's perspective had shifted dramatically. He thought back to the man he had been before that fateful day in the cemetery, driven, successful, but ultimately hollow. The loss of James had left a void in his life that no amount of business success could fill. But now, as he reflected on the past year, he realized how much he had grown and changed. His relationship with Michael had deepened in ways he could never have imagined. The adoption process had been finalized 6 months ago, and Alexander felt a sense of pride and love every time he introduced Michael as his son. Watching Michael flourish as the director of the gallery, seeing him gain confidence and skill in navigating both the art world and the corporate world, filled Alexander with a joy he had thought he'd never feel again after James's death. Alexander's leadership style had evolved as well. He was more empathetic, more willing to listen to diverse viewpoints. The company's new focus on social responsibility had attracted a wave of young, idealistic talent, and Alexander found himself energized by their passion and fresh ideas. Even his relationship with his own father, Howard, had improved. The older man's support during the gallery confrontation had opened the door to more honest, open communication between them. They still didn't always see eye to eye, but there was a new respect and understanding in their interactions. As he stood lost in thought, there was a knock at his office door. It was Sarah Chen, now head of the company's corporate social responsibility division. "Mr. Rothschild," she said with a smile, "the new outreach program reports are ready. And Michael called. He says he'll meet you at the cemetery in an hour." Alexander nodded, feeling a mix of emotions at the reminder. It was the anniversary of James's death, and he and Michael had plans to visit the grave together. But this year felt different. The pain was still there, but it was tempered by a sense of peace and purpose that had been missing for so long. As he made his way to the cemetery, Alexander reflected on the unexpected journey of the past year. He had gone from a man hiding from his grief to one who had opened his heart and his life to new possibilities. He had found a way to honor James's memory that felt true and meaningful. Arriving at the cemetery, he saw Michael already there, placing a fresh bouquet on James's grave. As Alexander approached, Michael looked up and smiled, the sun glinting off the tears in his eyes. "I was just telling James about the new scholarship program," Michael said softly. "I think he would have loved it." Alexander put his arm around Michael's shoulders, feeling a surge of love for this young man who had become such an integral part of his life. "I think so too," he replied. "James brought us together in a way. I'll always be grateful for that." As they stood there, paying their respects to James and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point, both Alexander and Michael felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had found in each other the family they both needed, and together, they were creating a legacy that would honor James's memory for years to come. The path ahead was not without its challenges, but as Alexander looked at Michael, he felt ready to face whatever came their way. They had each other now, and that made all the difference. As Alexander and Michael left the cemetery, walking side by side, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. The events of the past year had transformed not just their lives, but the lives of countless others touched by their story and the work of the James Rothschild Memorial Gallery. Their journey reinforced the powerful themes that had emerged from their chance encounter: the possibility of second chances, the healing power of connection, and the importance of staying true to one's values. Alexander had learned that true success wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives he could positively impact. Michael had discovered that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that his art could be a force for change. Together, they had shown that it's never too late to change course, to open one's heart, to make a difference. Their story, born from tragedy but blossoming into hope, had become an inspiration to many. As they reached their car, Alexander paused, looking back at James's grave one last time. "You know," he said softly, "I think James would be proud of what we've accomplished." Michael nodded, his eyes shining. "I think so too. And I know he'd be happy to see how much you've changed, how much you've grown." Alexander smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He had found a way to honor his son's memory, to be the father he wished he'd been to James, and to make a real difference in the world. As he and Michael drove away towards the future they were building together, Alexander knew that this was just the beginning of their story. The millionaire and the young man from the grave had found in each other not just family, but a shared purpose. A purpose that would continue to shape their lives and the lives of others for years to come.